Tonight, we're descending into the fluorescent corridors of a small-town government laboratory where the impossible became real. We're exploring Hawkins, Indiana, a place where Cold War paranoia, childhood innocence, and interdimensional horror collided in the autumn of 1983. This is the complete mythology of Stranger Things, a story about how human ambition tore a hole in reality itself and unleashed darkness that would haunt a generation. This isn't just the story of monsters and psychic children. It's the story of how a single experiment opened a gateway that should never have been opened. How a dimension of decay and death began bleeding into our world. How creatures from nightmares walked suburban streets. And how a group of kids on bikes became the last defense against an invasion from the other side. The mythology of Stranger Things is built on layers. Government conspiracies inspired by real Cold War experiments. An alternate dimension that mirrors our own in twisted, horrifying ways. Creatures that obey a collective intelligence beyond human comprehension. And at the center of it all, two psychics whose conflict would determine the fate of both worlds. Let's start at the beginning. Not in 1983 when Will Byers vanished, but decades earlier, in the shadowy world of post-World War II government research. The foundation for everything that would happen in Hawkins was laid in secret programs that most Americans didn't know existed and wouldn't have believed if they did. In the years following World War II, the United States and Soviet Union entered the Cold War, a decades-long struggle for global dominance that never quite erupted into direct military conflict, but created endless proxy wars and an arms race that consumed trillions of dollars and countless lives. Both superpowers sought any advantage, any weapon, any edge that might tip the balance. And both were willing to explore territories that ethics and morality suggested should remain unexplored. The CIA initiated Project MKUltra in 1953. It was a covert program designed to research mind control, behavioral modification, and the potential military applications of drugs like LSD. The project ran for 20 years, involving dozens of universities, hospitals, and prisons. Test subjects often had no idea they were being experimented on. Informed consent was a concept the CIA ignored when convenient. MKUltra explored whether humans could be programmed, whether memories could be erased or implanted, whether psychic abilities might be real and replicable. Most experiments failed or produced inconclusive results. The program was officially halted in 1973, and most records were destroyed. But in the world of Stranger Things, MKUltra didn't end. It evolved. It went deeper underground, into facilities hidden from oversight, funded through black budgets that congressional committees never saw. Hawkins National Laboratory was one such facility. Ostensibly operated by the Department of Energy, conducting research into nuclear power and related technologies, the laboratory's real function was far more sinister. Beneath the respectable cover of energy research, Hawkins' lab continued the work MKUltra had begun, exploring the outer boundaries of human consciousness and the thin barriers between dimensions. The man who ran Hawkins' lab was Dr. Martin Brenner. To the outside world, Brenner was a respected scientist, contributing to America's energy independence and national security. To his test subjects, he was something different. They called him Papa, a term of endearment that masked the horror of their relationship. Brenner wasn't a father figure. He was their captor, their torturer, their creator in ways that violated every principle of medical ethics. Brenner believed that psychic abilities were real and could be induced through the right combination of drugs, trauma, and training. He believed that accessing alternate dimensions was possible if you found someone with sufficient mental power to tear through the barriers separating realities. And he believed that the ends, specifically American victory in the Cold War, justified any means, no matter how monstrous. The test subjects at Hawkins' lab were children. Brenner targeted pregnant women, particularly those who were vulnerable or marginalized. He administered experimental drugs during pregnancy, hoping the substances would alter fetal brain development in ways that produced psychic abilities. Most pregnancies ended in miscarriage or produced children with no special abilities. But some succeeded, creating children who could move objects with their minds, read thoughts, see remote locations, and eventually open doors to other dimensions. These children were numbered. Each successful subject received a designation: 1, 2, 3, and so on, up to 17. They were raised within the laboratory, never knowing freedom, family, or normalcy. Their childhoods consisted of training exercises, experiments, and tests designed to push their abilities to the limit and beyond. Those who failed to develop sufficiently were disposed of. Those who succeeded became weapons. But before there were 17 test subjects, there was one. And his story begins not in Hawkins' lab, but in a modest house on the outskirts of Hawkins, in a different time, with a different horror. His name was Henry Creel. He was born in 1947 in Nevada to Victor Creel, a World War II veteran, and Virginia Creel, who came from wealth. Henry had an older sister, Alice. The family seemed normal from the outside, but Henry was anything but normal from his earliest years. As a young child, Henry disappeared for 12 hours. The circumstances remained murky, but during that absence, Henry encountered something. He was transported briefly to an alternate dimension, a realm of floating rocks and wandering creatures, a place untouched by human civilization. The exposure changed him fundamentally. When he returned, he possessed abilities no child should have. Telepathy, telekinesis, powers that would grow stronger as he aged. Henry's parents noticed something was wrong. His affect was flat. His social interactions were performative rather than genuine. He showed no empathy, no connection to other humans. Teachers and doctors examined him, declared him troubled, broken. But none understood the true nature of what Henry had become during those 12 missing hours. The family moved to Hawkins, Indiana in 1959 after Virginia's great-uncle died and left them money. They purchased a large Victorian house on the edge of town, hoping a fresh start might help Henry. It didn't. The house became the site of increasingly disturbing events. Henry spent his time in the attic, fascinated by the black widow spiders that nested there in the cold. He studied them obsessively, identifying with their predatory nature, their patient web building, their efficient killing. Henry saw himself as a predator among prey, superior to the humans around him who seemed weak and pathetic in their desperate need for connection and meaning. He practiced his abilities, killed small animals to test his power, showed his family horrific visions to torment them. And eventually, he read their thoughts and discovered that they feared him, that his mother Virginia was planning to have him institutionalized, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone. On March 14, 1959, Henry made his decision. If his family wanted to imprison him, they would pay with their lives. Using his psychic abilities, he attacked his mother and sister, showing them nightmares, then crushing their bodies with telekinesis. Bones snapped. Eyes were torn from sockets. They died in agony while Henry's father Victor watched helplessly, his mind breaking under visions Henry forced into his consciousness. The psychic exertion left Henry comatose. When authorities arrived, Victor was blamed for the murders and institutionalized. Henry remained in a coma, his crimes undiscovered. And that's when Dr. Martin Brenner entered the picture. Brenner had been monitoring the Creel family after Virginia contacted him seeking help for her son. He'd observed Henry, recognized his extraordinary abilities, and wanted him for the research program at Hawkins' lab. When Henry fell into a coma after the murders, Brenner used his government connections to claim custody of the boy's body. Henry Creel disappeared from official records and reappeared as Subject 1, Patient SOU-1 at Hawkins National Laboratory. When Henry eventually woke from his coma, he found himself a prisoner. Brenner explained the arrangement with clinical precision. Henry would cooperate with testing and training, or Brenner would expose his crimes and ensure he spent his life in prison or a psychiatric facility. To ensure compliance, Brenner had a chip implanted in Henry's body that suppressed his psychic abilities, rendering him powerless. For years, Henry lived in this suppressed state, forced to work as an orderly at the very facility that held him captive. He watched as Brenner attempted to replicate his abilities in other subjects through the MKUltra program. Most failed. Pregnant women were dosed with experimental compounds. Some miscarried. Some delivered children with no abilities. But gradually, Brenner created a collection of psychic children, numbered 2 through 17. Henry served as a supervisor for these children, helping with their training while his own powers remained locked away. It was cruel irony. The most powerful psychic Brenner had ever encountered was forced to nurture children who would never approach his potential. But Henry was patient. He observed. He learned. He waited for an opportunity. That opportunity arrived on June 7, 1971, when a newborn girl was taken from her mother within hours of birth. The mother was Terry Ives, a college student who'd participated in the MKUltra program at Hawkins' lab while unknowingly pregnant. The drugs she'd been administered affected her developing child in unprecedented ways. This baby girl showed immediate signs of powerful psychokinetic ability. She was designated Subject 11, the 11th successful test subject. She was raised in Hawkins' lab from infancy, knowing no other life. She had no family, no identity beyond the number tattooed on her wrist, 011. She had Dr. Brenner, who styled himself as her father, but was actually her captor and torturer. And she had the other numbered children, fellow test subjects, who became the closest thing to family she had. 11 grew up in a world of white walls, painful tests, and constant demands to push her abilities further. Brenner was never satisfied. He pushed 11 to move heavier objects, to reach farther with her mind, to access abilities that required enormous mental strain. The training was brutal. Failure meant isolation. Success meant more difficult tests. By 1979, 11 had developed her abilities to a remarkable degree. She could move objects without touching them, could kill with a thought if sufficiently enraged, could enter deep meditative states that allowed her to access remote locations and spy on distant targets. She was Brenner's greatest success. Proof that his methods worked, that psychic abilities could be cultivated and weaponized. But 11 was also rebellious. She questioned Brenner's authority. She resisted the more brutal aspects of the testing regime. She formed genuine bonds with the other numbered children, particularly 2 through 10, who became her peers and friends in that white-walled prison. Henry, still working as an orderly with his abilities suppressed, saw in 11 an opportunity for escape. He befriended her, offering kindness where others were harsh, encouragement where others were critical. He positioned himself as her ally, the one person in the facility who truly understood her suffering. 11, desperate for genuine connection, responded exactly as Henry hoped. On September 8, 1979, Henry made his move. He revealed to 11 that he wasn't just an orderly. He showed her the tattoo on his wrist, 001. He explained that he'd been the first, that Brenner had held him captive for decades, that they were both prisoners of the same monster. And he told her about the chip suppressing his powers, begging her to remove it so they could escape together. 11 trusted him. She used her abilities to locate the chip within Henry's body and tear it free. The moment his powers returned, unshackled after years of suppression, Henry Creel felt whole for the first time in decades. His abilities rushed back stronger than ever. He was magnificent. He was unstoppable. And he had a facility full of people who deserved to die. Henry told 11 to hide in a closet, to wait while he cleared a path for their escape. She obeyed, trusting him completely. Then she heard the screams. Henry moved through Hawkins' laboratory like death itself. Guards died first, their necks snapped psychically. Scientists followed, crushed by invisible force. Henry took his time with some of them, making them experience terror before he killed them. And then he turned his attention to the other numbered children. 2 through 17 had done nothing to Henry personally. Most were younger than 11, some barely old enough to understand their circumstances. But Henry killed them anyway, not from rage, but from philosophy. These children were Brenner's weapons, extensions of the system Henry despised. Better that they die now before they could be used. He killed them methodically. 2, 3, 4, 5, falling one after another. Some tried to fight back with their developing powers, but they were children facing someone who'd refined his abilities over decades. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 17. Each death was efficient, brutal. Henry showed no mercy and felt no remorse. Brenner fled when the massacre began, but there was one loose end remaining, 11. She emerged from the closet to find carnage, blood, and broken bodies of the only family she'd ever known. Henry stood at the center of it all, utterly calm, covered in blood that wasn't his. He explained his philosophy to her. He spoke about how humanity was broken, how people lived in cages of their own making, how the world needed to be remade from scratch. He told her he'd seen into countless minds and found nothing but fear, pain, and desperate clinging to structures that caused suffering. He wanted to tear it all down, to create something new from the ashes. And he invited 11 to join him. 11, staring at the corpses of her friends, said no. One simple word. No. She wouldn't help him destroy everything. She wouldn't become what he was. Henry attacked. If she refused to join him, she was an obstacle to be eliminated. He used his powers to pin her against a wall, to begin crushing her as he'd crushed the others. But 11 fought back with every ounce of power she possessed, fueled by love for her murdered friends and the single memory of her mother holding her after birth. The battle was titanic. 2 extraordinarily powerful psychics unleashing everything they had against each other. The room shook, objects flew, the walls cracked. Henry was more experienced, more skilled, more practiced. But 11 had something he lacked. She had love, she had connection, she had reasons beyond herself to fight. She channeled everything into one devastating psychic push. And she didn't just defeat Henry, she tore open a hole in reality itself. A gateway to another dimension opened in the wall, swirling with otherworldly energy. Henry, screaming, was flung through that impossible portal into a realm of darkness and decay. The gateway sealed behind him, leaving Eleven collapsed and traumatized. The effort overwhelmed her. Eleven's mind couldn't process what had happened, couldn't accept that she'd killed all those children, even though Henry had done it. She repressed the memory, buried it so deep that she convinced herself she was the murderer. This false memory would haunt her for years. But we're not following Eleven's immediate story. We're following what happened to Henry. And Henry's story was just beginning in that other dimension. The place Henry arrived wasn't the Upside Down, not yet. It was something older, more primal. Later, some would call it Dimension X. It was a wasteland of floating rocks, dead plains, and wandering creatures. The dimension was unspoiled by humanity, exactly as Henry had dreamed. It was perfect in its desolation. But the journey through dimensional barriers changed Henry fundamentally. As he fell through that impossible space, energy arced across his body. Not electricity, but dimensional force that burned and scarred. His skin blistered and charred. His hair was singed away. The agony lasted forever and no time at all. When Henry finally came to rest in that other dimension, he was barely recognizable as human. His skin had taken on a grayish, corpse-like quality. Burns covered his flesh in patterns that would never fully heal. His clothes were reduced to burned rags. But he was alive, and after the initial shock, he discovered his powers remained intact. Stronger even. The dimensional transit had enhanced rather than diminished his abilities. Henry explored his new environment. The dimension was vast, alien, hostile. Strange creatures wandered the landscape, predatory things that resembled Earth animals, but twisted, corrupted. There were humanoid creatures with elongated limbs and flower petal heads full of teeth. Creatures he would eventually learn were called demogorgons by the children who would encounter them years later. And there was something else. Henry discovered a storm of particles, a swirling mass of shadow that seemed alive, responsive. This entity was formless, chaotic, powerful. It recognized Henry as something compatible, something that could give it direction and purpose. The entity was ancient, perhaps older than Earth itself, waiting in this dimensional wasteland for someone to shape it. Henry, remembering his childhood fascination with black widow spiders, decided to give the entity form. He used his psychic powers to mold the particle storm, stretching it, shaping it, creating structure from chaos. The result was a massive spider-like being with a flame-shaped head, towering stories tall, composed of living shadow particles connected through psychic force. Henry had created the Mind Flayer, though that name wouldn't come until much later. And in creating it, Henry transcended his human limitations. The Mind Flayer became his vessel, his weapon, his means of exerting control over everything in this dimension. Through the Mind Flayer's hive-mind connection, Henry could command every creature, every vine, every spore. He became distributed across the entire realm, present everywhere simultaneously. But Henry's body continued changing. Over months and years, the burns healed incompletely, leaving him permanently disfigured. His pupils faded to milky white. His nose dissolved entirely, leaving skeletal openings. Vines from the dimension grew into his body, merging with his organs, replacing damaged tissue. His left hand elongated grotesquely, fingers stretching into claws. He was becoming part of the dimension itself, integrated into its biology. The dimension Henry inhabited wasn't the Upside Down yet. That transformation wouldn't occur until 1983, But Henry, now calling himself Vecna after a powerful lich from Dungeons & Dragons lore, spent years building his power, refining his control, preparing for an eventual return to the world that had rejected him. He needed a gate, a doorway back to Earth. He was patient. He had time. The dimension moved differently, time flowing at odd angles. He would wait as long as necessary for the opportunity he needed. That moment came on November 6, 1983. 11, now 12 years old and still imprisoned at Hawkins' laboratory, was ordered by Brenner to make psychic contact with a creature his instruments had detected in Dimension X. A Demogorgon, wandering near the dimensional barrier. Brenner wanted intelligence on this creature, wanted to know if it could be controlled or weaponized. 11 was placed in a sensory deprivation tank that amplified her abilities. She entered a deep, meditative state, extending her consciousness across dimensional boundaries. When her mind touched the Demogorgon, something unexpected happened. The contact was too powerful, too direct. The psychic force tore through the fabric of reality, creating a physical gateway in the wall of Hawkins' laboratory. The gate, later called the Mother Gate, opened with a sound like tearing metal. A rift appeared in the wall, glowing red and orange, pulsing with otherworldly energy. The barrier between dimensions had been breached. And through that breach, the Demogorgon entered, Hawkins. But more than just creating a gate, 11's contact transformed Dimension X. The moment the connection was established, the dimension began mirroring Hawkins. Buildings appeared, twisted reflections of the town above. Streets formed in the decay. This was no longer Dimension X. This was the Upside Down, a mirror dimension that existed as both reflection and corruption of the world Vecna intended to conquer. Everything in Hawkins existed in the Upside Down, but dead, decayed, overgrown with vines and slime. The air was thick with toxic spores. The sky was perpetually dark, lit only by occasional red lightning. And everywhere, the presence of the Mind Flayer, the hive intelligence that connected every living thing in that realm. Vecna, monitoring events through his hive mind connection, recognized his opportunity. After years of isolation, he finally had access to the world above. The gate was open. The invasion could begin. The Demogorgon that entered Hawkins was the first soldier in that invasion. It hunted by smell rather than sight, tracking blood and heat. It was searching for prey, for hosts, for anything living that could be brought back to the Upside Down. And on the night of November 6th, 1983, it found a 12-year-old boy riding his bike home through the woods near Hawkins' laboratory. Will Byers was an ordinary kid from an ordinary family, playing Dungeons and Dragons with his friends like they did every week. He was riding home late, his bike light cutting through darkness, when he encountered something impossible. The Demogorgon appeared on the road before him, its flower petal head opening to reveal rows of teeth. Will ditched his bike and ran for his house. He made it to his yard, into the shed behind his home. But the Demogorgon followed. In the shed, surrounded by tools and childhood memories, Will Byers was pulled into the Upside Down. He became the first human victim of the dimensional breach, dragged into a nightmare realm where he would fight for survival for the next week. Will's disappearance launched an investigation that would expose everything. His mother, Joyce, refused to believe he'd simply run away. Police Chief Jim Hopper, a man dealing with his own tragedies, began digging into the case and discovered inconsistencies pointing toward Hawkins' laboratory. And Will's friends, Mike Wheeler, Dustin Henderson, and Lucas Sinclair, began searching for him on their own. unwilling to accept that their friend was gone. The same night Will disappeared, 11 escaped from Hawkins' laboratory. The creation of the gate had caused chaos at the facility. In the confusion, 11 fled into the woods surrounding Hawkins, desperate for freedom. She was found by Mike and his friends, shivering and terrified, dressed in a hospital gown with a shaved head and the number 11 tattooed on her wrist. The boys took her in, hiding her from adults and authorities. 11 couldn't speak much, traumatized by years of experimentation and imprisonment. But she recognized Will from a photograph. She'd seen him in the Upside Down during her psychic explorations. She knew he was alive, and she became determined to help find him. What followed was a week of horror as Hawkins came under siege from the Upside Down. The Demogorgon killed several people, including Barbara Holland, a teenager who was taken while sitting alone by a swimming pool. Pulled through a temporary gate the creature created. The monster brought victims to the Upside Down, using them as hosts or food for the dimension's growth. Joyce Byers discovered she could communicate with Will through electrical systems. The Upside Down and the real world were connected through electromagnetic fields, allowing Will to manipulate lights and electronics from the other side. Joyce covered her walls with Christmas lights, painting an alphabet so Will could spell out messages. It was desperate and insane, but it worked. Will was alive, hiding in the upside-down version of his house, slowly running out of time as the toxic atmosphere poisoned him. Hopper and Joyce eventually entered the Upside Down through the gate at Hawkins' laboratory. They found Will unconscious in the upside-down version of the shed where he'd been taken. A tendril from the dimension forced down his throat. They pulled him out, brought him back to the real world, rushed him to the hospital. He survived, but his connection to the Upside Down wasn't severed. It had infected him, changed him, made him part of its hive mind even after his physical rescue. Meanwhile, 11 confronted the Demogorgon at Hawkins Middle School. The creature had tracked her there, drawn by Brenner's pursuit and the psychic energy she radiated. In a final desperate act, 11 used the full extent of her powers to destroy the Demogorgon, disintegrating it at the molecular level. The effort was so immense that 11 herself seemed to vanish, pulled into the space between dimensions. The gate at Hawkins' laboratory remained open. Hawkins' lab attempted to contain it, but the breach was permanent, carved into reality by psychic force beyond anything they could counter with physical means. The Upside Down began spreading from that gate, growing vines and tunnels beneath Hawkins, corrupting the ground itself. For a year, Hawkins' lab monitored the situation. They burned the vines extending from the gate, trying to contain the spread. But the gate was growing, extending deep underground, forming an intricate tunnel system that honeycombed beneath the town. The Upside Down was slowly claiming territory, inch by inch. And Will Byers, rescued and seemingly recovered, was still connected to the hive mind. He had episodes where he flashed back to the Upside Down, seeing visions of that dark realm. He could feel the Mind Flayer's presence, a massive shadow looming in the distance. He was no longer entirely human. Part of him belonged to the other side. In October 1984, the Mind Flayer made its direct move. It possessed Will completely, turning the boy into a spy. Through Will's eyes and mind, the Mind Flayer could see everything happening in Hawkins, could learn about the laboratory and its defenses, could plan its assault. The possession was insidious. At first, Will didn't realize what was happening. He felt cold constantly. He had gaps in his memory. He acted strangely, saying things that seemed off. But gradually, The Mind Flayer's control deepened. Will was becoming a vessel, his consciousness pushed aside to make room for the invading intelligence. The Mind Flayer used Will to discover the laboratory's plans. When Hawkins' lab personnel entered the tunnels beneath town to burn the vines, the Mind Flayer learned the location through Will's connection. It sent an army of demodogs, adolescent demogorgons that hunted in packs, to attack the laboratory. The assault was brutal. Soldiers and scientists were torn apart by creatures that appeared from every direction. Bob Newby, Joyce's boyfriend, died saving others during that attack. He was trapped in the laboratory when the demodogs invaded, and he sacrificed himself to give others time to escape. His death was tragic proof that the Upside Down's invasion wasn't abstract horror. It was killing real people, destroying families, creating wounds that would never fully heal. Will's friends and family realized he was possessed. They attempted to exorcise the Mind Flayer from Will's body, using heat which the shadow creature was vulnerable to. They took Will to Hopper's cabin, raised the temperature until Will was suffering from heat stroke, literally burning the Mind Flayer out of him. The exorcism worked partially. A portion of the Mind Flayer's shadowy essence was forced from Will's body, expelled through his mouth like black smoke. But the main bulk of the Mind Flayer remained on the other side of the gate, and its hold on Will was only temporarily broken. The creature was still connected to him, still able to influence him if it regained strength. 11 returned during this crisis. She'd been in hiding, living with Hopper, who'd found her in the woods months earlier and kept her hidden from Brenner and the government. She'd been developing her abilities in isolation, growing stronger, and when Hawkins needed her most, she emerged to close the gate. Closing the mother gate required immense psychic force. 11 descended into Hawkins' laboratory, stood before the massive rift that had grown to gargantuan size, and used every ounce of power she possessed to seal it. The gate resisted, the Mind Flayer on the other side pushing back, trying to keep its doorway open. But 11 channeled her rage, her pain, her love for her friends, and forced the gate closed. The moment the gate sealed, the hive mind connection was severed. Every demodog connected to the Mind Flayer died instantly, collapsing where they stood. The vines stopped spreading. The invasion was halted. Hawkins was saved, or so everyone believed. But the Mind Flayer wasn't defeated. A fragment of its essence remained in the real world, the piece that had been expelled from Will's body. That fragment lay dormant at Brimborn Steelworks, a shut-down factory on the edge of Hawkins. It was disconnected from the main body, powerless, waiting for an opportunity to act. That opportunity came in July 1985. The Soviet Union, which had learned of the Upside Down through espionage and captured Hawkins' lab personnel, built a facility beneath the new Starcourt Mall in Hawkins. They'd developed technology capable of opening gates to the Upside Down, hoping to access the dimension for military purposes. When they activated their machine, the gate beneath Starcourt opened, and the dormant Mind Flayer fragment awakened. The Mind Flayer couldn't physically enter the real world, while the gate remained relatively small and controlled. But it could extend its influence, could possess living creatures through particles of itself. It started with rats in Hawkins' sewers, taking control of their bodies, making them consume chemicals and fertilizers, then forcing them to gather at the steelworks. There, the possessed rats melted into biomass, organic matter that the Mind Flayer shaped into a proxy body. As more rats and then humans were possessed and melted, the proxy body grew larger, more powerful, more capable. The Mind Flayer was building itself a physical form in the real world. a body made from the dissolved flesh of its victims. Billy Hargrove, Max's stepbrother, became the Mind Flayer's primary host. He was possessed at the public pool, infected by the Mind Flayer's particles. Through Billy, the Mind Flayer coordinated the possession of dozens of Hawkins residents, creating an army of flayed, people controlled by the hive mind and marked for dissolution into the growing proxy body. The flayed lived double lives. During the day, they appeared normal, going through the motions of their regular routines. But at night, they gathered at the steelworks, fed themselves chemicals to prepare their bodies for melting, and stood ready for their transformation into biomass. They were conscious throughout, aware they were being controlled, terrified but unable to resist. The Mind Flayer's proxy body eventually took the form of a massive spider-like creature made from melted flesh and bone. It was horrifying to witness, a violation of natural law, a monster composed of what had once been human beings. The proxy was hunting 11 specifically, trying to kill her before she could close the new gate. The confrontation came at Starcourt Mall. The Mind Flayer's proxy body attacked while Joyce Byers and Jim Hopper infiltrated the Soviet facility beneath the mall to shut down the gate-opening machine. 11 and her friends fought desperately against a creature that regenerated from damage and pursued them relentlessly. Billy, still conscious within the Mind Flayer's control, made a final choice. Max's pleading reached something human still inside him. In his last moment of autonomy, Billy turned against the Mind Flayer, positioning himself between 11 and the creature. The Mind Flayer killed him, but Billy's sacrifice bought crucial seconds. Joyce shut down the Soviet machine, destroying the gate beneath Starcourt. The moment the connection to the Upside Down was severed, the Mind Flayer's proxy body collapsed, reduced to inert biomass. The flayed who hadn't yet been melted were released from possession, and Hopper, who'd been in the facility when the machine exploded, was presumed dead, disintegrated by the energy release. Hawkins appeared saved again. The gate was closed, the Mind Flayer defeated, but the victory came with enormous cost. Hopper was gone. Billy was dead. Dozens of people had been possessed, traumatized, some killed. And the Upside Down remained intact on the other side of reality, waiting. For 8 months, Hawkins enjoyed relative peace. The Byers family, unable to stay in a town with so many painful memories, moved to California. They took 11 with them, giving her a chance at normal life away from the laboratory and the government agents still seeking her. Hawkins tried to heal, tried to move forward, tried to pretend the nightmare was over. But in the Upside Down, Vecna had been preparing. He'd learned from his previous failures. He'd realized that large-scale invasions through obvious gates brought too much attention, too much resistance. He needed a subtler approach. He needed to create gates that couldn't be easily closed, gates carved through the deaths of specific victims. Vecna spent months building a new ability. He learned to extend his consciousness across dimensions, to reach from the Upside Down into the minds of people in Hawkins. He learned to form psychic connections so intense they became physical links between worlds. And he learned to identify the most vulnerable targets, teenagers carrying trauma they couldn't process. In March 1986, Vecna began his assault. His method was refined and horrifying. He would establish psychic contact with a victim, usually while they slept or during moments of distress. Once the connection formed, he would trap them in a mental landscape constructed from their worst memories and deepest fears. A customized hell designed to break them psychologically. While trapped in these visions, victims would see Vecna himself manifesting. He would explain what was happening, would watch as hope drained from their eyes. And when they reached their breaking point, Vecna would kill them using the same method he'd used on his family in 1959. Telekinetic force breaking limbs, dislocating jaws, tearing eyes from sockets. But the deaths weren't just murders. Each killing created a gate. The intense psychic connection between Vecna and his victim, maintained through the moment of death, tore reality itself. Small rifts appeared at each killing site. Permanent gates that couldn't be closed through normal means. Vecna's plan required 4 deaths, 4 gates, arranged in a specific pattern. When the 4th gate opened, they would converge, creating one massive rift that would merge dimensions completely. The Upside Down would bleed into Hawkins permanently, transforming the town into a hybrid realm where Vecna could physically enter and begin his conquest of Earth. His first victim was Chrissy Cunningham, the head cheerleader at Hawkins High. Chrissy appeared perfect on the surface, popular, pretty, dating the star basketball player. But beneath that exterior, she was suffering from her mother's emotional abuse and had developed an eating disorder. She was seeking drugs to help her escape, which brought her to Eddie Munson, known drug dealer on the night Vecna struck. While Eddie was retrieving what she'd asked for, Vecna made contact. Chrissy froze, her consciousness pulled into a nightmare version of her home. She heard her mother's voice calling, distorted and wrong. She followed it through darkened hallways and found her mother in a doorway. But the woman's face was decaying, twisted. Behind her loomed Vecna himself, emerging from shadows. He spoke to Chrissy about her pain, about how she'd tried to escape it, about how she'd always been doomed to this moment. Then he killed her. Eddie returned to find Chrissy standing motionless, eyes rolled back, unreachable. Her body rose into the air. Her limbs began snapping, her jaw dislocated. Her eyes were torn from their sockets. Then she dropped, dead. Eddie screamed and ran. The first gate opened in his trailer where Chrissy died. It was small but stable, a permanent wound in reality. And Vecna felt it open. 1 down, 3 to go. His second victim was Fred Benson, a student journalist carrying guilt from a car accident where he'd killed someone a year earlier. Fred was investigating Chrissy's death with Nancy Wheeler when Vecna trapped him in visions of his accident, forcing him to relive his worst moment repeatedly. Fred died in the woods, bones broken, eyes gone. A second gate opening where he fell. The third victim was Patrick McKinney, a basketball player hiding abuse from his father. Vecna took him while he was on a boat at Lover's Lake, levitated him over the water, broke him, and dropped him into the depths. A third gate opened beneath the lake's surface. 3 down, 1 remaining. And Vecna had already selected his final victim, Max Mayfield. Max was perfect for Vecna's purposes. She'd survived an abusive childhood, watched her stepbrother Billy die, and blamed herself for his death. She was depressed, isolated, consumed by guilt. Vecna had been watching her for weeks, recognizing her as the ideal final sacrifice. Max started experiencing visions. She saw Billy's corpse, bloodied and accusing. She heard a grandfather clock chiming when no clock was present, saw it manifesting in walls and doorways. The clock was Vecna's calling card, a countdown to death. Her friends noticed her distress and began investigating. They discovered the connection between the current murders and the Creel family murders from 1959. Nancy and Robin visited Victor Creel in a psychiatric hospital, learning about the demon he believed had killed his family. Slowly, they pieced together the truth. The killer was Henry Creel, Victor's son, who'd become one at Hawkins' lab, who'd been banished by 11, who'd become Vecna. Understanding who Vecna was didn't provide a way to stop him. Max was already marked, already experiencing his visions. On March 24th, 1986, Vecna made his move. Max was at Billy's grave when she entered a trance, pulled into Vecna's mental prison. She found herself in a twisted version of the cemetery. Billy's corpse emerged from the grave, rotted and accusatory, telling her it was her fault he died. Then Vecna appeared, massive and terrifying, towering over her. He told her she would be his final victim, his masterpiece, that her death would make everything possible. But Max's friends had discovered something crucial. Music could break Vecna's connection. Strong emotional ties to specific songs created anchors to reality that could pull victims from Vecna's mental traps. They found Max's favorite song, Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush, and played it through her Walkman headphones. The music reached Max, even in Vecna's prison. It became a lifeline, a path back to reality. She began running, fleeing from Vecna through the nightmare landscape. He pursued her, his massive form crashing through mental architecture, telling her she couldn't escape. But Max kept running toward a glowing red door, a manifestation of her connection to reality. She burst through just as Vecna's hand reached for her. She woke in the cemetery, gasping, surrounded by her friends. She'd escaped, becoming the first person to survive Vecna's attack. And without the fourth death, Vecna's plan was stalled. The 3 existing gates weren't enough to create the convergence he needed. The group realized they needed to go on offensive. They couldn't wait for Vecna to attack Max again. They needed to find his physical location in the Upside Down and kill him while he was vulnerable during his next attempt. Through Nancy's investigation, they discovered his lair, the Creel house. Of course it was the Creel house, the Victorian structure where Henry had killed his family, where he'd first demonstrated his full powers. Vecna had claimed it as his base in the Upside Down. The plan was complex. A team would enter the Upside Down through the gate at Lover's Lake and attack Vecna's physical body. Meanwhile, Max would serve as bait in the real world, allowing herself to enter Vecna's trance to distract him. As long as he was focused on killing Max, he couldn't defend his physical form. Steve Harrington, Nancy Wheeler, and Robin Buckley entered the Upside Down. They reached the Creel house and found Vecna's body, suspended in vines and tendrils, integrated into the house's structure. They attacked with Molotov cocktails and shotguns, setting him on fire, shooting him repeatedly. In the mental landscape, Max was fighting for her life. Vecna had her trapped, was slowly breaking her bones, destroying her body while keeping her conscious. She screamed for help as her limbs snapped. Then 11 arrived. She'd been in Nevada, separated from the group, but she created a makeshift sensory deprivation tank from a pizza parlor freezer and salt. She projected her consciousness across the country, entered the Upside Down psychically, and confronted Vecna in the mental realm. The battle between 11 and Vecna was titanic. He told her she'd made him, that by banishing him, she'd created the monster he'd become. He said they were alike, that she belonged with him. 11 refused, told him she was nothing like him, would never be like him. But Vecna had grown stronger in the years since their first confrontation. The Upside Down had amplified his powers. His connection to the Mind Flayer had made him more than human. He overpowered 11, threw her consciousness aside. In the Creel house, Vecna's burning body fell from a window. Steve approached cautiously, but when he reached the spot, the body was gone. Vecna had escaped into the Upside Down's depths, wounded but alive. And in Hawkins, Vecna completed his work on Max. Her limbs snapped, her eyes were torn away, her heart stopped. She died, becoming Vecna's fourth victim technically, even though 11 was fighting him. 4 gates tore open across Hawkins, massive rifts that began at the sites where Chrissy, Fred, Patrick, and Max had died. The gates spread through Hawkins like cracks in glass, carving through streets and buildings, converging toward a central point. They created an enormous X-shaped rift that split the town into quadrants. The Upside Down began bleeding through immediately. Spores filled the air. Vines and decay spread across familiar streets. Hawkins was being transformed into a hybrid realm. But 11 refused to let Max die. Even as Max's heart stopped, 11 reached into her chest psychically and restarted it through sheer will. She pulled Max back from death, brought her body back to life. Max's heart beat again. Her lungs drew breath. But when 11 searched for Max's consciousness in the void, the dark psychic space where 11 could find anyone, she found nothing. Max's mind was gone, taken by Vecna in the moment of death. Her body lived, kept alive by 11's power and by medical intervention. But Max Mayfield, the girl who'd survived abuse and loss in Vecna's first attack, was effectively dead. Only an empty shell remained, comatose and mindless. Vecna had achieved his goal. 4 deaths, 4 gates, Hawkins breached. The town was invaded, corrupted, transformed. Residents fled en masse, abandoning homes and businesses. The military established a perimeter, but they had no idea how to fight an interdimensional invasion. Hawkins was falling to the Upside Down, and no one knew how to stop it. The gates continued spreading slowly, consuming more territory with each passing day. The Upside Down's influence extended further from the rifts, turning Hawkins into a wasteland of ash and decay. Creatures from the other side could cross freely now, establishing hunting territories in the real world. From his lair in the Upside Down, Vecna observed what he'd accomplished. He was wounded from the assault on his body, burns covering him again, but he would heal. He had time. The gates were open. The invasion had begun. Everything he'd planned for years was coming to fruition. The Mind Flayer, that cosmic entity Vecna had shaped and controlled, spread its influence through the gates more directly than ever before. It could touch the world above, could begin corrupting and claiming territory in ways that had been impossible when dimensions were fully separated. But Vecna's victory wasn't complete. He'd failed to kill 11. He'd failed to claim Max's mind entirely, her consciousness vanishing to somewhere he couldn't reach. And his enemies were still alive, still fighting, still refusing to surrender Hawkins to his control. The mythology of Stranger Things at this point is rich with interconnected elements. The Upside Down exists as both mirror and corruption of reality. Every location in Hawkins has a counterpart in that dark realm, preserved in the state it existed when 11 first opened the gate in 1983. Time doesn't flow normally there. The dimension is stuck, frozen, constantly decaying. The Mind Flayer operates as a hive intelligence connecting everything in the Upside Down. Every creature, every vine, every spore is part of its network. When one part of the hive learns something, all parts know it. When one part is attacked, all parts respond. It's a distributed consciousness that makes conventional warfare nearly useless. Vecna sits at the apex of this hive mind. He shaped the Mind Flayer and claims to control it, to use it as his weapon. But the question of who truly controls whom remains open. Did Vecna shape a cosmic entity to his will, or did the entity manipulate him into giving it form and purpose? The answer matters because it determines whether defeating Vecna would end the threat or merely remove one servant of something far older and more dangerous. The creatures of the Upside Down serve the hive mind. Demogorgons are apex predators, hunting by smell, attacking with vicious efficiency. They're intelligent enough to stalk prey and set ambushes, but not sapient in any recognizable way. Their weapons, biological killing machines designed for one purpose. Demodogs are adolescent demogorgons, smaller but faster, hunting in packs. They're more aggressive than their adult forms, less cautious, more willing to swarm targets. A single demodog is manageable. A dozen are nearly unstoppable. The vines that spread from the Upside Down are part of the hive mind's sensory network. They feel vibrations, detect movement, report information back to the Mind Flayer. Burning them causes the hive mind pain. Damaging them reveals the network's locations. But they regenerate quickly, spreading through soil and infrastructure like invasive roots. The particles that compose the Mind Flayer can possess living creatures. They enter through breathing or through direct contact with corrupted tissue. Once inside a host, they begin exerting control, suppressing the host's consciousness, using their body as a vehicle. Possession is gradual, allowing the Mind Flayer to operate hosts as spies before fully converting them. The gates themselves are wounds in reality, places where dimensional barriers have been torn or burned through. The mother gate at Hawkins' lab was carved by 11's psychic contact with the Demogorgon. The gates created by Vecna's victims were carved by the combination of psychic connection and violent death. Both methods require enormous energy, either psychic or technological. Closing gates requires equal or greater force than opening them. 11 closed the mother gate through pure psychic power, but it exhausted her completely. The gates created by Vecna's kills might be unclosable through conventional means because they're tied to deaths, to trauma burned into reality itself. Closing them might require undoing the deaths that created them, which is impossible, or might require Vecna's death, which hasn't been achieved. The mythology also includes the human element. Hawkins' laboratory represents government overreach, the willingness to sacrifice individuals for national security, the hubris of scientists who believe they can control forces they barely understand. Brenner is the embodiment of this, a man who caused immense suffering in pursuit of victory in a war most Americans didn't even know was being fought on psychic battlefields. The children of Hawkins, the kids on bikes who became heroes, represent innocence confronting horror. They're not soldiers or scientists. They're just kids who refused to accept that their friend was dead, who refused to leave 11 to suffer alone, who kept showing up to fight monsters they had no business facing. Their heroism is rooted in loyalty and love rather than duty or training. The adults who help them, Joyce and Hopper primarily, represent the older generation trying to protect children from threats they don't fully understand. Joyce refuses to accept official explanations when her maternal instinct says something's wrong. Hopper uses police authority and military experience to investigate impossible situations. Both are broken by personal tragedies, making them willing to believe in the unbelievable. The mythology raises questions about the nature of power and its corrupting influence. Henry Creel had extraordinary abilities from childhood and concluded that he was superior to normal humans, that their lives were meaningless, that he had the right to judge and destroy them. His philosophy emerged from genuine suffering, from being rejected and feared. But it led him to commit atrocities that no suffering could justify. 11 had similar abilities and similar suffering under Brenner's control. But she chose differently at every turning point. She formed genuine connections with Mike and her friends. She valued other people's lives. She used her power to protect rather than dominate. The difference between Vecna and 11 is philosophical rather than circumstantial. They prove that power doesn't corrupt inevitably, that choice matters more than ability. The mythology also explores trauma and how it propagates through generations. Will's experience in the Upside Down traumatized him in ways that a week of therapy couldn't address. His possession by the Mind Flayer left him with episodes and flashbacks for years. Max's witnessing of Billy's death and her inability to save him created guilt that made her vulnerable to Vecna. Trauma is weaponized by the Upside Down, used as an entry point for corruption and control. But trauma is also what creates heroes. 11's trauma under Brenner's control made her powerful enough to fight Vecna. Joyce's trauma from losing Bob made her determined to protect others. Hopper's trauma from losing his daughter made him willing to sacrifice himself to save Hawkins. The show doesn't suggest trauma is good or necessary, but it does suggest that how you respond to trauma defines who you become. The mythology of Stranger Things is built on nostalgia, but subverts it. The 1980s setting invokes memories of a simpler time, of childhood adventures and suburban safety. But the show uses that nostalgic framework to tell stories about government experimentation on children, about dimensions of horror lurking beneath normalcy, about how the Cold War's paranoia had real and terrible consequences. The kids play Dungeons and Dragons, watch movies, ride bikes, have adventures. But their adventures involve real death, real trauma, real monsters. The show asks what happens when childhood innocence collides with adult horror, when kids have to face threats that adults refuse to believe in or are complicit in creating. The influence of other media on Stranger Things mythology is obvious and intentional. Stephen King's influence appears in the small-town setting, the government conspiracy, the psychic children. Spielberg's influence appears in the wonder and terror of encountering the impossible. John Carpenter's influence appears in the atmospheric dread and the threat of possession. The show wears its influences proudly, while creating something original from those borrowed elements. The science of the Upside Down is deliberately vague, operating more on dream logic than physics. The dimension mirrors Hawkins, but is frozen in 1983. Why? Because that's when 11 opened the first gate, when the dimensions first connected. The Upside Down copied Hawkins at that moment and stopped updating, but that's more mystical than scientific, suggesting the dimension is conscious or reactive in ways that defy natural law. The toxic atmosphere of the Upside Down slowly poisons humans who breathe it. Will survived a week by hiding in the Upside Down version of his house and finding shelter. But he was dying by the time he was rescued. The spores that fill the air are part of the Mind Flayer's sensory network, allowing it to detect intruders and gradually infect them. Time moves differently between dimensions. Hours in the Upside Down might be minutes in reality, or vice versa. The inconsistency makes temporal mechanics impossible to predict. You might enter the Upside Down for what feels like an hour and emerge to find a day has passed. Or you might spend what feels like days only to find minutes elapsed. The future of the mythology remains uncertain as of the end of Season 4. Hawkins is invaded. Vecna is wounded but alive. Max is comatose and missing her consciousness. 11 has lost her powers again from overexertion. The gates are spreading, the military is establishing a perimeter, and the Mind Flayer's influence is extending further into reality with each passing day. The final conflict will presumably involve closing the gates permanently, defeating Vecna, and somehow retrieving Max's consciousness from wherever Vecna stored it. But how any of that happens remains unknown. Vecna is more powerful than any previous threat. He's integrated with the Upside Down itself, making him nearly impossible to kill through conventional means. 11 will need to recover her powers and surpass her previous limits. The group will need to find Vecna's weakness, some vulnerability they can exploit. They'll need to understand the connection between Vecna and the Mind Flayer, well enough to sever it or destroy both simultaneously. And they'll need to do all of this while Hawkins continues falling to the Upside Down's corruption. The mythology suggests that the final battle will be between 11 and Vecna, two psychics shaped by Brenner's experiments, two people who responded to similar trauma in opposite ways. Their conflict is ideological as much as physical. Vecna believes humanity deserves extinction. 11 believes connection and love give life meaning. Their battle will determine which philosophy prevails. But the mythology also suggests that defeating Vecna might not be enough. The Mind Flayer existed before Henry Creel shaped it. The dimension existed before 11 opened the first gate. Closing the current gates might not seal the Upside Down permanently. The barrier between dimensions was always thinner near Hawkins for reasons never fully explained. Something about that location made it easier to breach reality there. Perhaps Hawkins sits on a convergence point, a place where dimensional barriers are naturally weak. Perhaps something happened there historically that damaged those barriers. Perhaps the government chose to build Hawkins' lab there specifically because they detected unusual readings or phenomena. The show hasn't answered these questions yet, but they loom over the mythology. The question of whether the Upside Down is inherently evil or simply alien and hostile is important. Is it a malevolent dimension that exists to corrupt and destroy, or is it simply incompatible with human life? The Mind Flayer's actions suggest malevolence, but it might be following instincts that seem evil from a human perspective, but are simply survival from its own. If the Upside Down is inherently evil, then it must be destroyed or sealed away permanently. If it's simply alien, then perhaps coexistence is possible with strong enough barriers. The mythology leans toward the former interpretation, suggesting the Upside Down is fundamentally opposed to life and order, representing decay and entropy made manifest. The role of government in the mythology is consistently negative. Hawkins' lab created the conditions that allowed the Upside Down to invade. The military's response to the invasion is inadequate and often counterproductive. The Soviet Union's attempts to weaponize the Upside Down nearly destroyed Hawkins. Every institution that should protect people instead endangers them through incompetence or malice. This anti-institutional streak reflects both 1980s Cold War paranoia and contemporary distrust of government. The heroes are always outsiders. Kids, outcasts, small-town cops, working-class parents. The authorities are always obstacles at best, enemies at worst. The mythology suggests that salvation comes from grassroots resistance rather than institutional power. The sacrifice that heroism requires is a constant theme. Bob died saving others. Hopper sacrificed himself to close the Soviet gate. Billy died protecting 11. Eddie Munson, introduced in Season 4, died creating a distraction that saved others. Heroism in Stranger Things isn't about glory or recognition. It's about choosing to die so others can live, about making yourself expendable for the sake of those you love. The mythology also explores the concept of found family. None of the main characters have perfect traditional families. Mike's parents are distant and oblivious. Dustin is raised by a single mother. Lucas faces racism and family pressure. Will's father abandoned him. Max's family is abusive. Eleven has no biological family she knows. They build family from friendship, creating bonds that prove stronger than blood. This found family becomes their greatest strength. They trust each other, absolutely. They risk everything for each other, repeatedly. They refuse to abandon each other, no matter how dangerous the situation becomes. The Mind Flayer's hive mind operates on forced connection and control. The party operates on chosen connection and love. That difference becomes tactically significant. The mythology of Stranger Things is fundamentally about the tension between innocence and experience, between childhood wonder and adult corruption, between the world as it should be and the world as it is. The kids want to believe in heroes and happy endings. The adults know the world is more complicated and cruel. Both perspectives are necessary to survive the Upside Down's invasion. The show asks whether it's possible to face horror without becoming cynical, to fight monsters without becoming monstrous, to grow up without losing what makes childhood valuable. The answer seems to be yes, but only through deliberate choice and constant effort. Max almost succumbed to despair before her friends pulled her back. Will almost lost himself to possession before his family saved him. 11 almost became Vecna's partner before she rejected his philosophy. The mythology also raises questions about destiny versus choice. Is 11 destined to fight Vecna because Brenner created both of them? Is Will destined to remain connected to the Upside Down because he was the first victim? Or do they have agency to determine their own futures regardless of their origins? The show leans toward choice mattering more than destiny, toward free will determining outcomes despite circumstances. The visual mythology of the show reinforces these themes. The Upside Down is a dark reflection of the real world, everything familiar but twisted and wrong. It's nightmare fuel specifically because it's recognizable. You can see your own house, your own street, but corrupted beyond recognition. It suggests that horror isn't separate from normalcy, but lurks beneath it. That everything safe could become dangerous. The Christmas lights Joyce uses to communicate with Will symbolize hope-piercing darkness. The Demogorgon's flower petal head suggests beauty and horror intertwined. Vecna's clock represents time running out, death as inevitable. These visual elements add layers to the mythology beyond dialogue or plot, creating a rich symbolic language. The mythology's exploration of the 1980s includes both celebration and critique of that era. The show loves the movies, music, and pop culture of the period, but it also acknowledges the darker aspects. The Cold War's existential dread, the AIDS crisis mentioned briefly, the Reagan administration's policies, the casual bigotry and bullying that characterized the time. Hawkins itself represents small-town America, the idealized heartland that politicians invoke but that the show portrays with complexity. It's a place where people know their neighbors, but also where secrets fester, where community exists but exclusion is painful, where safety is assumed but danger lurks beneath the surface. It's neither wholly good nor wholly bad, just complicated in ways that both rural and urban Americans recognize. The mythology will presumably conclude with Season 5, which hasn't aired yet as of this recording. The resolution will need to address the open gates, Vecna's survival, Max's consciousness, the Mind Flayer's true nature, and whether permanent peace is possible or whether the upside down will always threaten reality. Whatever the ending, the mythology of Stranger Things has already established itself as a significant contribution to science fiction and horror. It's created a rich world where government conspiracies, interdimensional threats, psychic abilities, and the power of friendship coexist in ways that feel both fantastical and emotionally real. The story resonates because it's fundamentally about ordinary people facing impossible situations and refusing to give up. About children who shouldn't have to be heroes becoming heroes anyway. About trauma that could break people instead, making them stronger. About darkness that could consume everything being held back by determined resistance. If you made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through the complete mythology of Stranger Things. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Hawkins, the Upside Down, and the cosmic horror lurking beneath small-town America, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Deep Lore for more comprehensive explorations of the worlds we love. Drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of Stranger Things mythology you find most fascinating, or what other shows and universes you'd like us to explore next. And if you really want to support the channel, share this video with someone who's been consumed by the Upside Down's mysteries as much as we have. Until next time, this has been Deep Lore. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, friends don't lie. Thanks for watching.